The annual Federal Judicial Conference wasn't supposed to make headlines. These gatherings typically featured dry procedural discussions, policy updates, and polite networking among legal professionals. But on this particular autumn morning, something extraordinary unfolded, a moment that would challenge everything we think we know about power, respect, and institutional integrity. Picture a grand courtroom filled with America's legal elite, seasoned federal judges, prominent attorneys, law professors, and a handful of invited lawmakers. The air conditioning hummed quietly as morning coffee was served. Attendees shuffled through printed agendas, expecting another routine day of legal discourse. Then Representative Jasmine Crockett took the podium. Crockett, a 43-year-old civil rights attorney turned Congresswoman from Texas, had been invited to discuss criminal justice reform, a topic she knew intimately from her years as a public defender. Her opening remarks were measured and well-researched, outlining disparities in sentencing, the crisis of mass incarceration, and the urgent need for systemic change. But as her speech progressed, something shifted. We can no longer accept judicial interpretations that preserve inequality, she declared, her voice rising with conviction. When federal courts consistently uphold systems that disproportionately harm marginalized communities, we must question whether outdated legal frameworks are being used to justify present-day injustice. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the audience. Judicial independence, Crockett continued, cannot be a shield for rulings that perpetuate harm. Respect is earned through justice delivered, not simply granted because of a title. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. From the front row, a figure rose with deliberate grace. Judge Edith Jones, nearly 4 decades on the federal bench, thousands of cases decided, a reputation for fairness that transcended partisan lines, walked toward the podium with measured steps. At 74, Judge Jones carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating complex legal waters. Her expression was unreadable, but those who knew her recognized the signs. This was a moment she felt compelled to address. Congresswoman Crockett, Judge Jones began, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. May I respectfully interject? The room fell into absolute silence. What followed wasn't a shouting match or a political spectacle. It was something far more powerful, a principled defense of constitutional boundaries delivered with surgical precision. Your passion for reform is evident and, in many respects, admirable, Judge Jones continued. But your remarks today and in recent months reflect a troubling misunderstanding of the judiciary's constitutional role. Crockett remained at the podium, visibly caught off guard but listening. When you suggest that judges should modify their interpretations based on social outcomes rather than legal precedent and constitutional text, Judge Jones explained, you undermine the very foundation of judicial independence. That independence exists not to frustrate reform, but to protect every citizen, especially the vulnerable, from the shifting winds of political pressure. The judge's words carried weight earned through decades of service. She wasn't lecturing, she was educating. Furthermore, Judge Jones added, implying that judicial respect should be conditional, granted only when you agree with our rulings, sets a dangerous precedent. It threatens the separation of powers that our founders considered essential to protecting liberty. Here's where the story takes a remarkable turn. Instead of doubling down or deflecting, Representative Crockett did something increasingly rare in public life. She paused, genuinely listened, and reconsidered. Judge Jones, Crockett responded, her tone noticeably softer. I appreciate your willingness to address this directly. Could you help me understand where my approach may have crossed important lines? That simple question transformed everything. The confrontation became a conversation. The tension gave way to dialogue. What could have escalated into a partisan battle instead became a masterclass in institutional respect. Judge Jones's demeanor shifted subtly from stern authority to something more collaborative. Not quite mentorship, but certainly guidance between colleagues in public service. The difference, Congresswoman, the judge explained, lies between advocating for legislative reform and suggesting that courts should abandon legal principles to achieve policy goals. Your role is to change laws you believe are unjust. Our role is to interpret and apply those laws as written, not as we might wish them to be. Crockett pulled out a notebook and began taking notes. Let that image sink in. A sitting member of Congress taking notes from a federal judge in a public forum. Many judges, Jones continued with striking candor, see the same injustices you do. We encounter the consequences of poorly designed laws every single day. But our oath requires us to apply those laws faithfully. If they produce unjust outcomes, the solution isn't judicial activism, it's legislative reform pursued through proper constitutional channels. So you're saying, Crockett offered, looking up from her notes, that when I see sentencing disparities I believe are unjust, my focus should be on changing the sentencing laws themselves, not criticizing judges who are following existing guidelines? Precisely, Judge Jones confirmed. And when you pursue that work with genuine respect for judicial independence, you'll often find judges who welcome thoughtful legislative reforms that allow us to deliver justice more effectively. Then came the moment that stunned everyone present. Judge Jones, Crockett said, her voice carrying a sincerity that silenced the room. I need to apologize, publicly and without reservation. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Over recent months, Crockett continued, my frustration with outcomes I perceived as unjust led me to make statements that were inappropriate and disrespectful toward the judiciary. I allowed my passion to cloud my understanding of constitutional principles and the proper relationship between our branches of government. Her voice grew steadier, more confident. As a former attorney, I should have known better. The strength of our legal system comes from its independence, not from judges bending to popular opinion. My comments suggested otherwise, and for that I am truly sorry. What happened next is almost unheard of in federal court settings. Spontaneous applause erupted, first from a few attorneys, then spreading throughout the entire courtroom until everyone was standing. Even court staff, normally paragons of stoic professionalism, joined in. Judge Jones allowed the ovation to continue for nearly a minute before gently raising her hand for quiet. Congresswoman Crockett, she said, warmth now evident in her voice. What you've demonstrated today is the essence of true leadership. The courage to admit mistakes and choose growth over pride. That is exactly the character our democracy requires. Within hours, video of the exchange went viral. Not because of conflict or drama, but because of its rarity. A genuine moment of humility, learning, and institutional respect in an era defined by polarization and performative politics. Legal scholars from across the ideological spectrum praised both women. Law schools incorporated the footage into constitutional law courses. Political science professors cited it as a textbook example of how democratic institutions should interact. Most importantly, it inspired behavioral change. Other lawmakers reconsidered their own rhetoric about the judiciary. Young lawyers and future policymakers studied it as a model for graceful accountability and constructive dialogue. 6 weeks later, Judge Jones and Representative Crockett appeared together at a national constitutional law symposium. Their joint presentation on advocacy, reform, and institutional respect received standing ovations. "What Judge Jones taught me," Crockett told the audience, "is that real reform starts with understanding and respecting the system you're trying to improve. You can't build stronger institutions by undermining the respect that sustains them." Judge Jones, in turn, praised Crockett's evolution. "The Congresswoman has proven that passionate advocacy and institutional respect can powerfully complement one another. Since our exchange, her legislative work has been both more impactful and more constitutionally sound. This wasn't just a story about a courtroom confrontation diffused. It was a reminder of something we desperately need to remember. American democracy thrives not when we avoid disagreement, but when we engage in it with humility, respect, and shared commitment to constitutional values." Judge Jones defended judicial independence not to protect her own authority, but to safeguard the constitutional structure that protects everyone's rights. Representative Crockett demonstrated that true strength lies not in never making mistakes, but in acknowledging them and choosing to learn. Together, they showed that wisdom can still triumph over ego, that institutional integrity still matters, and that leaders willing to place principles above pride can transform conflict into collaboration. The enduring impact years from now. Law students and political science majors will study this exchange not because of what was said, but because of what it represented: a return to first principles, a recommitment to institutional respect, and proof that American democracy's framework still works when leaders have the courage to let it. In a federal courtroom on an ordinary autumn morning, two remarkable women reminded us that the best of American governance emerges when power meets principle, when conviction encounters humility, and when leaders value truth more than being right. That's not just a moment worth remembering. It's a standard worth aspiring to.